First tonight, for 14 years, Washington has been trying to get the founder of WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, put away in an American jail. The US was deeply embarrassed about him disseminating classified documents showing the American military in a bad light in Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, that process is now over for good, and it ended in the most unexpected place, a courtroom on a tiny Pacific island in US-run Saipan, where Julian Assange finally pleaded guilty to one count of espionage.
We firmly believe that Mr. Assange never should have been charged under the Espionage Act. It is appropriate for the judge, as she did today, to determine that no additional incarceration of Mr. Assange would be fair, would be appropriate, and it is time for him to be reunited with his family.
Well, as Julian Assange comes to the end of his legal process by pleading guilty to espionage, the American journalist Evan Gershkovich has begun his spying trial in Russia. He strongly denies the charges against him. The Wall Street Journal reporter is in court in Yekaterinburg, 1,500 kilometers east of Moscow. He was kept in a metal cage in the courtroom and his head was shaven, but correspondents say he looked in good shape, although under psychological pressure after spending nearly 15 months in jail in Moscow. The trial is taking place behind closed doors, which means that family members, US diplomats and the media won't be allowed in. His employer, the Wall Street Journal, has called it a sham trial and a bogus process. Well, for more on this, let's cross live to London and speak with Arise special correspondent John Cookson. Good to see you, John. Let's start with Julian Assange. What impression have you now got of Mr. Assange following this, if you like, ruling and the rights that Mr. Assange had to waive?
Well, we had this amazing story developing on Monday, Charles, when Assange left Belmarsh jail and walked out of jail, heading to Stansted Airport to board a private jet to go to Bangkok and then onwards to Saipan to face this hearing today. Judge Manglona, who was in charge of the case, wished him a happy life and wished him happy birthdays, 53 next week, and then he carried on to his home city of Canberra. There were some supporters there, as you quite rightly say, but generally speaking, it's been a kind of muted welcome, I think you might say, from the general population in Australia to Julian Assange, although politicians who've been working hard to free him across a number of years were on hand to remind us that they've been pressuring the US government for a long time for his release. It's good news for the freedom of the press, of course. Assange acquired all these secret documents, hundreds and thousands of them relating to the Iraq war and the Afghanistan war, and leaked them with the assistance of, you remember, Chelsea Manning, Charles, the transgender a secret agent, a US working for the US government. Or she rather, incidentally, was sentenced to 35 years for her part in all of this, although President Obama commuted that to 7 years, and she was released in 2020. So it's a closing chapter, really, for both, but especially Julian Assange, spending time, of course, now with his wife and kids in Australia. We'll have to wait and see what deal has been done, because for sure the Department of Justice will have extracted some concession from Julian Assange. I don't think he will have been persuaded to disclose his sources, but I suspect that some kind of arrangement has been made that he either stays quiet for the foreseeable, or gives a less than detailed account in possibly a forthcoming book, which we'll have to just wait and see. But Julian Assange tonight in the bosom of his family after such an ordeal lasting 13, 14 years now.
Indeed, and as you said, Mr. Assange now back in his native Australia, arriving back to a lot of cheers from his supporters. But I imagine that a lot of those supporters who were with him because they believed he was a sort of advocate of free speech, I mean, they'd be disappointed if he kept quiet.
Yes, but as I said a short time ago, maybe part of this deal is that there was some undertaking that Assange gave to the DOJ about what he could talk about and what he couldn't talk about. From what we know of him, I mean, he's of course a libertarian, and every journalist across the world I would think would be supporting him in what he's doing under the rights and freedom of the press. But we'll just have to wait and see how things work out in the coming months and years, whether he stays quiet or maybe there's more leaks to come. We'll have to wait and see.
Well, absolutely. But of course, as Julian Assange comes to the end of his legal process, presumably the end, by pleading guilty to espionage, the American journalist...
Charles, if you're there, I've lost you again.
Okay.
We can talk about Dershowitz if
right.
you like. You mentioned him in the intro. Dershowitz, a 32-year-old journalist for the Wall Street Journal, was employed by the Journal from 2022 onwards. He was arrested, as you said earlier, in Yekaterinburg in 2023, in March, just over a year ago, and has spent all of the time since in a tough Moscow jail. I must say, looking at the pictures, I agree that he looks in reasonable shape given his ordeal. Now, he now faces a trial behind closed doors. So there was an opening session today, but then the doors closed. Journalists were kicked out of the court, and the hearing will take place over the coming weeks and months. We'll know very little, I think, because it is behind closed doors. We can be fairly certain that Dershowitz will be found guilty of the single espionage charge that he's been accused of, because, well, frankly, because 99% of all Russian cases end in a guilty verdict, and even when that doesn't happen, prosecutors always appeal. In the murky world of prisoner swap, he has to be found guilty and then convicted before perhaps the United States or Russia can start talking about swapping him for someone else. Now, Vladimir Putin gave an interview to the journalist Tucker Carlson earlier this year and indicated to Carlson that that Putin would be up to considering a release of Dershowitz for a Russian senior figure in the Kremlin, Vadim Krasikov. Now, Krasikov assassinated a Chechen in Berlin in 2019. He's currently being held in Germany, and to get him free would have to have the consent, of course, of Germany. But that's one option for a prisoner swap. There is precedent. The basketball star Brittany Griner, who was facing 9.5 years in prison for possession of cannabis, was swapped for a Russian arms dealer. So there is precedent for this. But first of all, the trial has to take place. It's going to run for weeks and months, with probably a break during the summertime. And then we'll have to see whether the time is right for some kind of prisoner swap, and maybe there's someone else in the White House when this happens. But certainly difficult days, of course, for Evan, and he's 32 years old, looks in good shape, but appearances can be deceptive. But let's hope he's doing well. Charles.
Indeed, and John, I do apologize that your comms was interrupted there, but I mean, obviously you got what we were hoping for, which is your assessment of Evan Gershkovich and the fact that his trial on spying charges began today, and there's a recent history of Washington and Moscow doing legal deals. I was going to ask you what kind of likelihood is there of some kind of deal this time, but you answered that question, so thank you very much indeed. John Cookson, Arise special correspondent, talking to me there on the line from London.